If someone had told me a year ago that the man across the hall, the one with the shoulders that seemed to block out the sun and a laugh that could shake dust from my light fixtures, would end up sleeping on my couch, I would have laughed. A small, tight, anxious sound. The kind of laugh that is mostly just a gasp for air. Because my life was a carefully curated collection of quiet moments, a fortress built of routine and solitude. And Ben, my neighbor, was the siege engine parked just outside the gates. I didn't come to this apartment building looking for love. I came looking for silence, for a place with thick enough walls that I could pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. For the most part, it worked. My days were a predictable rhythm. Wake, coffee, work at my drafting table, lunch, more work, dinner, book, sleep. A metronome ticking away the quiet, lonely hours. It was safe. It was mine. Then Ben moved in. Unit 4B, directly across from my 4A. His arrival was not quiet. It was an event, a symphony of thudding furniture, booming laughter from his friends, and the constant, energetic presence of a man who took up more space than his physical form required. He filled the hallway with his energy. I could feel it through my door, a low hum of life that was both terrifying and magnetic. I learned his life in fragments, in sounds that bled through the walls. The scrape of his keys in the lock around 6:30 every evening. The heavy drop of his work boots on the floor. The sizzle of something in a pan. The smell of garlic and onions ghosting into the hallway. The low murmur of a television, usually some action movie with explosions that made my own floor vibrate. Sometimes there was music, loud, unapologetic rock music that I secretly found myself humming along to. From my peephole, I learned his face, the sharp line of his jaw, often shadowed with stubble. The way his dark hair fell over his forehead when he was tired. The easy, confident smile he gave the delivery guy. He was a landscape I studied from a great and unreachable distance. A mountain range I could see from my window, but would never dare to climb. He was, by all accounts and observations, spectacularly, intimidatingly straight. Girlfriends came and went. Pretty, laughing women who would touch his arm and lean into his space in a way that made my own stomach clench with a feeling I refused to name. The distance between us was exactly 12 feet of beige-carpeted hallway. A no-man's land I crossed as quickly as possible, my keys already in hand, my head down. We had a routine of near misses. I'd hear his door start to open, and I'd wait, my own hand frozen on my doorknob, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs, until the sound of his footsteps faded down the stairs. It was a pathetic, well-rehearsed cowardice. We exchanged maybe a dozen words in that first year. A tight hey in the lobby. A clipped thanks when I held the door. Each interaction left me feeling shaky and overexposed, as if I'd run a marathon. He was a bonfire, and I was a moth terrified of my own instincts. My solitude was a ship I had built myself, sturdy and provisioned for a long voyage alone. I had everything I needed. I told myself this every day. I was not lonely. I was independent. I was not hiding. I was private. These were the lies that kept the ship afloat. Then the sky broke open. The storm had been threatening all day, a bruised, purple stain spreading across the horizon. By evening, the wind was a physical thing, a monster clawing at my windows. The rain came down not in drops, but in solid sheets of water. The lights flickered once, twice, and then surrendered, plunging my carefully ordered world into a sudden, profound darkness. My routine was broken. The metronome had stopped. I wasn't scared. I was prepared. I had a cache of candles, a hand-crank radio, a camp stove for tea. This was just another form of quiet, another flavor of solitude. I lit a few candles, their small flames dancing and throwing long, wavering shadows across my living room. The familiar shapes of my furniture became strange and menacing. I settled onto the couch with a book, the howl of the wind my only soundtrack. Then came a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A frantic, desperate pounding on my door. My heart leaped into my throat. No one ever knocked on my door. Ever. It was a violation of the unspoken treaty between me and the world. The pounding came again, louder this time, punctuated by a voice. Ben's voice, muffled by the door and the storm, but unmistakably his. "Hello. Anyone in there?" Alex? I know you're in there, man. I can see the candlelight panic. A cold, nauseating wave. He knew my name. How did he know my name? Probably from the mailbox. Of course, from the mailbox, you idiot. I stayed frozen, a statue of indecision. Maybe if I was quiet enough, he would go away. He would assume I was asleep. Please, man. I'm in some serious trouble over here. The plea in his voice cut through my fear. It was raw and real. This wasn't the confident, booming Ben from the hallway. This was someone in need. Against every self-preservation instinct I owned, I uncurled myself from the couch, my limbs stiff with dread, and walked to the door. My hand trembled as I turned the deadbolt. I opened it a crack. He was soaked, utterly, completely drenched. Rainwater streamed from his hair, plastered it to his forehead. His t-shirt was a second skin, dark with water. But it was his eyes that held me. They were wide, frantic, a little wild. A tree branch, he gasped, gesturing vaguely back toward his own apartment. Came right through the living room window. It's raining inside my apartment. Everything's getting ruined. I opened the door wider. I couldn't do anything else. He stood there, dripping on my welcome mat, a force of nature brought low by a bigger one. He looked lost. He looked, for the first time since I'd met him, small. You should come in, I heard myself say. The words felt foreign in my own mouth. He stumbled inside, bringing the smell of rain and wet earth and ozone with him. He filled my small entryway, his presence immediately overwhelming the space. He dripped a puddle onto my floorboards. I should have cared. I should have been annoyed at the disruption, the mess. But all I could feel was the frantic, terrifying hum of his closeness. The siege engine was inside the fortress. For a moment, we just stood there in the flickering candlelight. Him, dripping and breathing heavily. Me, holding the door like an idiot, my knuckles white. The silence was charged, thick with the unsaid. He looked around my small, obsessively neat apartment, his eyes taking in the stacks of books, the carefully arranged pencils on my desk, the minimalist art on the walls. I felt seen. Stripped border. His gaze was an inventory of my soul. I'm so sorry to do this, he said. Finally, his voice raspy. I didn't know where else to go. It's okay, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I shut the door, the sound of the latch clicking into place, feeling unnervingly final. I was locked in with him, with the storm. I moved on autopilot, my body taking over while my brain tried to reboot. You need a towel? I went to the linen closet, my hands fumbling in the dark. I pulled out the fluffiest one I owned, the one I saved for. Well, I didn't know what I saved it for. Apparently, this. I held it out to him. As he reached for it, his cold, wet fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing, a ghost of a touch, less than a second. But a current, hot and sharp, shot up my arm and detonated somewhere in my chest. My breath hitched. It was the first time we had ever touched. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burnt. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Confusion? Before he looked away, rubbing the towel vigorously over his hair. My heart was a hummingbird trapped in my ribcage. The touch replayed in my mind, a tiny, searing loop. The rough texture of his skin against mine. The impossible, shocking heat of my own body against his cold one. It was too much, too real. This was a man I had only ever observed through layers of distance and drywall. Now he was here, a tangible, breathing reality, and my carefully constructed world was beginning to fracture. He took off his soaked t-shirt, and my brain simply short-circuited. He wrung it out over the sink in my tiny kitchen, his back to me. The candlelight carved his body out of the shadows, highlighting the sharp lines of his shoulder blades, the powerful curve of his spine, the intricate map of muscle. I had seen him in tank tops in the summer, but this was different. This was intimate. This was my space. I forced myself to look away, my face burning, and focused on a meaningless spot on the wall. Get a grip. He's just a guy. A wet guy who needs help. I found him a spare t-shirt of mine. It was laughably small on him, stretching tight across his chest and shoulders. The sight was both absurd and breathtaking. He looked like a giant who had accidentally wandered into a dollhouse. My dollhouse. Thanks, he said, his voice softer now. He ran a hand through his damp hair. Seriously, "Mun, you saved me. It's nothing." I mumbled, busying myself by lighting another candle. Anything to avoid looking at him directly. He wandered into my living room, his bare feet silent on the floorboards. He was still a disruptive force, but the frantic energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary tension. He stood in front of my bookshelf, his head tilted as he read the titles. I watched the way the candlelight caught the edge of a faint, silvery scar just above his eyebrow. I'd never been close enough to see it before. I'd never noticed the way he chewed on his lower lip when he was concentrating. These are details I had no right to, secret stolen by proximity. "You have a lot of books," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "I like to read," I replied, the most brilliantly insightful thing I could possibly think of. My wit was, as ever, dazzling. He turned away from the bookshelf and looked at me. His gaze was direct, and I felt pinned by it. "I'm banned, by the way. I know we've never really, Alex," I managed. "Alex," he repeated, and the way he said my name sent another stupid, traitorous jolt through me. It sounded solid in his mouth. Real. The wind howled, rattling the window panes. A particularly violent gust slammed against the building, and I saw Ben flinch. A small, almost imperceptible tightening of his shoulders. But I saw it. I, the professional observer, saw it. The big, strong man who wrestled with fire hoses or swung a hammer for a living, I was never sure which, was rattled by the storm. "You okay?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. He gave a short, self-deprecating laugh. "Yeah, just not a fan of storms," he gestured vaguely. "The whole tree in the living room thing doesn't help. I can make some tea," I offered, desperate for a task, for something to do with my hands. On my camp stove, a genuine smile touched his lips for the first time. It transformed his face, softening the sharp angles. "That would be amazing." As I fumbled with the tiny stove in the kitchen, I felt a shift in the air between us. It was subtle, a change in atmospheric pressure. He wasn't just an intruder anymore. He was a guest, and he was vulnerable. The power dynamic, which had always felt so hopelessly skewed, him the sun, me a forgotten planet in a distant orbit, was leveling out. Here, in my candlelit fortress, I was the one with the dry clothes and the camp stove. I was the one offering comfort. It was a strange, heady feeling. I brought him a steaming mug of peppermint tea. He had settled on my couch, his large frame making it look small. He took the mug, his fingers brushing mine again. This time I didn't pull away so quickly. I let the contact linger for a half-second longer than necessary, a tiny, reckless indulgence. The heat was still there, a low, simmering fire. He wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic, inhaling the steam. "This is nice," he said, and he sounded surprised. He looked around the room again, at the quiet order of my life. "It's so quiet in here. It's always quiet in here," I said. He looked at me over the rim of the mug, his eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering light. "Yeah, I've noticed." We sat in a strange, companionable silence for a while. The only sounds were the storm outside and the soft sip of him drinking his tea. The apartment, which usually felt like a perfectly sized shell for one, now felt charged and alive. His presence was a weight, but not an unpleasant one. It was a grounding force. I found myself breathing in sync with him, my own frantic energy slowly calming to match his weary stillness. "My girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, I guess, she hated storms," he said suddenly, his voice soft. He was staring into his mug, as if the tea leaves held some kind of answer. "She used to say they were bad omens, are they?" I asked, my voice equally quiet. He shrugged, a slow, heavy movement of his shoulders. "We broke up last month." Maybe she was right. He let out a long breath. It wasn't working. It hadn't been for a long time. We were just going through the motions, pretending to be two people we weren't. I didn't know what to say. This was a level of intimacy I was completely unprepared for. This was the kind of conversation people had after months of friendship, not minutes of forced cohabitation. But the darkness was a confessional. The storm was a truth serum. "I'm sorry," I said, because it was the only thing I could think of. He looked up from the mug and met my eyes. "Don't be. It's for the best." He paused, a strange, searching look on his face. It's just lonely, you know? The quiet after. My apartment feels too big now. Too empty, and there it was. A crack in the facade. The confident, social man whose apartment was always filled with the sound of other people was lonely. The word hung in the air between us, a shared and terrible secret. I knew lonely. Lonely was the architect of my entire life. The candles burned lower, the shadows growing longer and deeper. The storm outside seemed to be easing its rage, settling into a steady, percussive drumming of rain. The world was shrinking, contracting until it was just the two of us in this small, warm pocket of light. My couch, my books, my quiet life, and him, the man from across the hall, the beautiful, impossible stranger. He finished his tea and set the mug down on the coaster I had, of course, provided. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was expectant. It was a space waiting to be filled. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. A warning drum, or an invitation. I couldn't tell which. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me. He's straight. He's vulnerable. He's just had a breakup. Don't be a fool. Don't misread this. But the other part of me, the part one kept locked away, was captivated by the way the light caught the moisture in his eyelashes, the way his presence made the very air in the room feel thick and sweet like honey. He broke the silence. His voice was so low it was almost a whisper. You know, in the whole year I've lived here, I've never seen you bring anyone home. The observation landed like a stone in my gut, cold and heavy. I like my own company, I said, the lie tasting like ash. He didn't call me on it. He just nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. The intensity of his gaze was a physical pressure. I hear you sometimes, he said, through the wall, your pencil scratching on paper. The quiet music you play late at night, my breath caught. He listened for me, just as I listened for him. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. We were two lonely people, separated by a wall, listening to the echoes of each other's lives. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. The space between us on the couch, which I had tried to maintain as a respectable buffer zone, suddenly felt non-existent. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could smell the peppermint from the tea on his breath. Alex, he said, my name is Soft Question. Why have you never invited me in before? The question shattered me. It was so simple, so direct, and there was no easy answer. Because I'm a coward. Because looking at you hurts. Because if you came in, you might see the way I look at you. Because you're straight and I'm not, and the 12 feet of hallway between us is the only thing keeping my stupid, fragile heart safe. I couldn't say any of that, so I said nothing. I just looked at him, my throat tight, all the unspoken words clogging my lungs. And in my silence, he found his answer. I saw the understanding dawn in his eyes. A flicker of surprise, followed by something else. Something I couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't disgust. It was recognition. He closed the remaining distance between us. It was a slow, deliberate movement. There was no rush. It gave me 1,000 opportunities to pull away, to protest, to break the spell. I did none of them. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a hope so fierce it felt like terror. His hand came up, not to my face, but to my arm. He just rested it there on my forearm. His touch was warm and firm and grounding. His thumb stroked the sensitive skin of my inner wrist once. A simple, questioning gesture. My eyes fluttered shut. My entire universe had contracted to that single point of contact. Is this okay? He whispered, his voice thick. I couldn't speak. I just gave a small, jerky nod. It was more than okay. It was the terrifying, beautiful, world-ending thing I had been dreaming of and dreading for a year. He leaned in closer. I could feel his breath on my cheek. And then his lips touched mine. It wasn't a passionate, movie-style kiss. It was hesitant. It was soft. It was a question asked in a language 1,000 times more honest than words. His lips were chapped from the wind, and they moved against mine with a gentle, searching pressure. It was a kiss of shared loneliness, of camelot confession. It tasted of rain and peppermint, and a longing so profound it made my bones ache. I lifted a trembling hand and rested it on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart under my palm. It was real. This was real. He was real. And he was kissing me. The morning came too soon, as it always does. It arrived not with a gentle dawn, but with the harsh, unforgiving glare of reality. The power was back on. The digital clock on my cable box blinked a relentless, accusatory green. 7:04 a.m. The storm was over, and he was gone. I woke up on the couch, a blanket I didn't remember pulling over myself tangled around my legs. The apartment was still and silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the peaceful solitude I was used to. It was an absence, a hollow space where he had been. The air felt thin, stripped of the energy and warmth his presence had brought. My heart, which had felt so full and slow and steady last night, was now a frantic, panicked thing, a trapped bird beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. I sat up, my head thick with a sleep that hadn't been restful. My eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for any sign of him. There was a piece of paper on my coffee table, a single sheet torn from the notepad I kept by my phone. His handwriting was a strong, masculine scrawl, completely at odds with the delicate lines of my own. Thanks for everything, Ben. That was it. Thanks for everything, for words. For polite, dismissive, utterly devastating words. It was the kind of note you leave for a stranger who helps you change a flat tire. The kind of note that neatly erases a night of shared vulnerability and impossible kisses. It was a full stop, an ending. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over me. What have you done? The question screamed in my head. My anxiety, a beast I usually kept sedated with routine and isolation, was awake and roaring. It clawed at my insides, filling my stomach with a swarm of angry bees. It was a mistake. The thought was a relentless refrain. His girlfriend just left him. He was lonely and scared of the storm. You were just convenient, a port in the storm. And you, like an idiot, read everything into it. I stumbled into the kitchen. The mug he had used was sitting in the sink, a faint peppermint scent still clinging to it. The t-shirt I'd lent him was folded neatly on the counter. Every trace of him was tidy, contained, and gone. It was a clean getaway. I walked to my front door and looked through the peephole. His door across the hall was closed. It was just a door again, a barrier. The 12 feet of hallway had returned to being a canyon, wider and more impassable than ever before. Last night, we had bridged it. This morning, the bridge had been burned. The self-recrimination was a physical torment. How could I have been so stupid, so hopeful? He was Ben, the guy with the endless parade of girlfriends. The guy who radiated a confident, easy heterosexuality. A moment of Camelot confusion didn't change that. I had taken his vulnerability and twisted it into something it wasn't. I had projected all my pathetic, secret longing onto him, and he had probably felt it. He was probably across the hall right now, cringing with regret, or worse, with pity. The silence from his apartment was a physical weight pressing down on me. Before, the sounds of his life had been a source of quiet fascination. Now, the absence of those sounds was a form of torture. Every creak of the building's old floorboards made me jump. Was that him? Was he leaving? Was he packing a bag to move away so he wouldn't have to face the awkward, pining gay guy across the hall? My own apartment, my sanctuary, felt like a prison. The walls that were meant to protect me now felt like they were closing in, mocking me with the memory of what had happened within them. The couch where we kissed felt tainted. The air still held the ghost of his scent. He was everywhere and nowhere. I spent the day in a fog of misery. I tried to work, but I just stared at the blank page on my drafting table, the lines blurring through a film of unshed tears. I tried to read, but the words were just black marks on paper, meaningless and mocking. The silence stretched. An hour. 3 hours. The entire agonizing day. No music from his apartment. No sound of the television. Nothing. My former solitude, the one I had cultivated so carefully, had been a comfortable, worn-in sweater. This new solitude was a hair shirt. It was loneliness, raw and sharp and tainted by the memory of connection. I had been given a glimpse of what it felt like to not be alone, and the subsequent plunge back into isolation was a brutal, dizzying fall. I hated him for it. I hated him for showing me what I was missing. But mostly, I hated myself for wanting it so badly. By evening, I had worked myself into a state of numb resignation. It was over. It was a one-time anomaly, a strange story I would never tell anyone. I would have to find a way to go back to the way things were, to the polite nods and the averted eyes in the hallway. The thought was unbearable. It felt like trying to force a shattered vase back together. The pieces would never fit the same way again. I would always know it was broken. I was making myself a pathetic dinner of toast when I heard it. A sound from the hallway. Footsteps. Slow, hesitant footsteps. They stopped outside my door. My entire body went rigid. The toast in my hand forgotten. I held my breath, listening. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden, deafening silence. Then a knock. Not the frantic, desperate pounding from the night of the storm. This was a soft, uncertain knock. A question. I didn't move. It was him. It had to be him. What did he want? To apologize? To tell me to forget it ever happened? To ask for his t-shirt back? I didn't think I could bear it. My fortress was already in ruins. I couldn't watch him come back to salt the earth. He knocked again, a little louder this time. Alex? It's Ben. Can we talk? His voice was strained. He sounded nervous. That was new. Ben was never nervous. Slowly, as if moving through water, I put the toast down and walked to the door. This was it. The final confrontation. The clean, surgical cut to sever whatever fragile, imaginary thread had been spun between us in the dark. I took a deep breath, braced myself for the impact, and opened the door. He looked awful. His eyes were red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept. The confident, easy posture I was so used to was gone, replaced by a tense, hunched-over stance. He was clutching something in his hand. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. "Hey." I replied, my own voice a faint echo. We stood there for a beat, the silence stretching between us, thick with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't been said. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at his shoes, at the floor, at anything but me. "I'm an idiot," he said finally, the words a low rush. "I'm so sorry. The way I left this morning, that was cowardly." I just stared at him, my mind unable to process the words. I had been expecting an apology, but not for that. He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, raw vulnerability that stole my breath. I woke up, and the sun was shining, and everything was normal again. And I panicked. I freaked out. "Alex," he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure agitation. "What happened last night, that's never happened to me before. With a guy. With anyone, really. Not like that. It felt," he trailed off, searching for the word. "It felt more real than anything I've felt in a very long time. And it scared the hell out of me. My throat was too tight to speak. All the scenarios I had tortured myself with all day, his regret, his pity, his disgust, they all dissolved, replaced by a single, stunning realization. He hadn't run away from me. He had run away from the feeling. From the same terrifying, world-altering thing that I was feeling. I spent all day walking around the city," he continued, his voice low and earnest, "trying to make sense of it, trying to convince myself it was a mistake, that it was just a storm, that I was just lonely. But it wasn't. It was you." He took a hesitant step closer into my doorway. "The truth is, I've been noticing you for a year, too. I'd hear you through the wall, and I'd wonder what you were doing. I'd see you in the hall, and you would look away so fast, and I always wondered why." He gave a small, sad smile. I think I was lonely long before my girlfriend left. And I think I was just too scared to admit what I was really looking for." He took a deep breath, like a diver preparing to plunge into deep water. "I don't know what this is, Alex. I don't have a map for this. But I know I don't want to go back to how things were. I don't want to be strangers separated by a wall anymore." He opened his hand. Resting in his palm was a single key. His key. "I know this is fast," he said, his gaze locked on mine, intense and unwavering. "And maybe it's crazy, but I want you to have this. For the next storm. Or just because. So that door between us doesn't feel so locked anymore." He was offering me a key. A key to his apartment. A key to his life. It was a tangible act of commitment, a promise. It was the most terrifying and beautiful thing anyone had ever offered me. Tears I hadn't even realized were forming pricked at my eyes. All the fear and anxiety that had been choking me for the last 24 hours finally receded, washed away by a wave of impossible, breathtaking relief. I reached out, my hand trembling, and took the key from his palm. It was warm from his skin, solid, real. "Okay," I whispered. It was the only word I could manage. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. It was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. "Okay, okay," I said again, a little stronger this time. I looked down at the key in my hand, then back up at him, and for the first time, standing in my own doorway, I didn't feel the urge to retreat. I stepped aside. "Do you want to come in?" His smile widened. "Yeah," he said, his voice full of a warmth that reached all the way inside me and quieted the frantic bird in my chest. "Yeah, I really do." The new beginning didn't start with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, domestic sound of a coffee maker brewing. The morning after his return was different. I woke up not to an absence, but to a presence. He was still there, asleep on my couch, one arm thrown over his head. The rising sun cast a gentle light across his face, and for the first time, the morning felt like a promise instead of an accusation. I made coffee. 2 mugs. The simple act felt revolutionary. My kitchen, designed for the solitary movements of one person, now accommodated 2. He woke up to the smell, stretching with a groan that made the couch creak. He walked into the kitchen, his hair a mess, and gave me a sleepy, lopsided smile that made my heart do a slow, happy roll in my chest. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I said, handing him a mug. Our fingers brushed. This time, there was no jolt of panic, just a soft, pleasant warmth, a comfortable hum of connection. We didn't talk much. We just stood in the quiet kitchen, sipping our coffee, watching the city wake up outside my window. It was a comfortable silence, woven with unspoken understanding. His boots, which he had left by the door, were no longer a sign of intrusion. They were a sign of arrival. They were a sign that he was here to stay. Over the next few days, the 12 feet of hallway between our apartments became a well-worn path. We started leaving our doors slightly ajar, a silent invitation. The sounds of his life were no longer a mystery to be deciphered through a wall. They were part of the texture of my own. I learned that the loud rock music was what he listened to while cleaning. I learned that the explosions from his action movies were often accompanied by his own soft snores because he always fell asleep halfway through. He learned the rhythms of my quiet. He learned that the scratching of my pencil meant I was working and not to be disturbed. He learned which classical music helped me concentrate. He started bringing me a coffee in the morning on his way out, leaving it on my doorstep if my door was closed, a silent offering that always made me smile. One evening, he was making dinner in his apartment, the smell of garlic and tomatoes filling the hall, and I was working in mine. A song came on his stereo, one I recognized, a soft, melancholic indie track. I found myself humming along. A few minutes later, a text lit up my phone. It was from him. "I can hear you humming. You have good taste." My face grew hot, but I smiled. The wall between us was no longer a barrier. It was a membrane, porous and alive. A week later, we were sitting on my couch, watching some old black and white movie I loved. It was late. Rain pattered softly against the window, a gentle echo of the storm that had started everything. He had his arms stretched along the back of the couch, his fingers lightly brushing my shoulder. The casual, easy touch sent a quiet thrill through me, a feeling of rightness that settled deep in my bones. "You know," I said, my voice soft in the dim light of the television, "I used to watch you through the peephole." He turned his head to look at me, a half-smile playing on his lips. "Yeah? What did you see?" "I saw someone whose life seemed so loud," I admitted, "so full of people and energy." It was intimidating. His smile faded slightly. "It was mostly noise," he said quietly. "A lot of it was just distraction." From how empty the quiet felt afterward, he shifted, turning to face me more fully. His hand moved from my shoulder to my neck, his thumb gently stroking the skin just below my ear. "Your quiet is different." It's not empty. It's full of books and music. And he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't like the first time, which had been hesitant and questioning. It wasn't like the second time, which had been desperate and full of relief. This was a kiss that was calm and sure and deeply, wonderfully tender. It was a kiss that felt like coming home. I looked back on a man I was before the storm. The one who built a fortress of solitude and called it independence. The one who believed that safety was the highest virtue, even if it meant a life half-lived. I had viewed Ben as a disruption, a force that threatened my carefully controlled world. And he was. He was a hurricane that tore through my life. But he didn't leave wreckage. He cleared a path. He broke down the walls I had built so carefully, not with force, but by simply showing me that I didn't need them. He showed me that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, and that true safety wasn't about being alone. It was about finding the one person whose presence makes you feel more yourself than you ever were on your own. My life now is not always quiet. It's filled with his laughter, with his terrible rock music, with the sound of 2 sets of keys hitting the bowl by the door. But it is peaceful. It is a quiet that is shared, a solitude that is a choice, not a necessity. The man across the hall, the beautiful, impossible stranger, turned out to be the most wonderful, unexpected plot twist of my life. He didn't just move across the hall. He moved into the empty spaces of my heart and filled them with a life I was never brave enough to imagine for myself. And I, in turn, gave him a key to my own world, a place where the quiet was no longer lonely, but a peaceful space for two.